Hi, my name is Tom Mehta. I'm the Director of Product Management for Transitional Data Services. I own the TransitionManager product line, and I wanted to take some time today to do a quick demonstration of how we can use TransitionManager to discover, analyze, plan, and automate rehosting workloads to the cloud with CloudEndure. First, let's walk through how we import application and workload data and relationships between them into the platform. I think it's worth noting that TransitionManager is not an auto-discovery tool. We discover data by aggregating data from the multiple sources of truth that you see at the enterprise. What we've found over the years is that enterprise IT organizations have the data that they need to execute on cloud migrations projects, but they don't get value out of it, right? Because it's stuck in siloed locations. Only certain people have access to it. It's tough to collate and organize every time you want to make a workload placement decision, right? In TransitionManager, our customers can use our data ingestion feature where they can automatically grab the most valuable data points from these sources of truth. Typically, you'll see about 3 to 5 data sources for each customer. An example sources of truth that I'm referring to would be auto-discovery tools. Some customers have auto-discovery in place, but if they're implementing as part of the project, we'll take that data in too. It provides valuable information on net flow and network connectivity type data. We can also layer in DSIM type tooling or ITSM type tooling that you might see in a ServiceNow or a BMC Atrium and aggregate all that in. And our customers will use this ETL feature to do that very quickly. The screen that you see on the demonstration is our import asset screen. And there's a couple options. We can fetch the data with an API call or an API action. As long as the endpoint can return application JSON data, we can iterate over that JSON spec and we can import the data into the system very quickly. More often than not, we'll receive a file extract, let's say from a CMDB or something like RV tools. And that's what I'll demonstrate here for you today. For folks that aren't familiar with RV tools, it's an open source executable that will go ahead and look at your virtual center database and it'll dump all the information out. If folks are familiar with the spreadsheet that it creates, it's about 20-something tabs, and there's a lot of relational data within it. And using our ETL script capability, which I'm doing here, I uploaded the data to the server, and now I'm applying the ETL script to that data. I can map source fields from the spreadsheet to my target in TransitionManager. I can put the information, I can transform it into a nomenclature that everyone expects, that's consistent, and that everyone can collaborate on. And I think most importantly, I can get rid of a lot of the noise. There's a lot of data in there that you don't really need to make a workload placement or a cloud, no cloud type decision. There's 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 data points that really matter. And you'll do this process that I'm doing now on the screen 3 to 5 times, and you can aggregate it all in one place. If we take a look at the import results here for my RV tools example, it created 10 application records. These are my virtual center clusters. It created my 503 devices. This includes my virtual machines that are running on the cluster. And it also includes the physical ESX hosts that are propping the clusters up, right? And on top of that, I was able to create dependency information. So if you recall, the RV Tools spreadsheet, it has a lot of relational data. So based on the ETL script intelligence, I can pull that relational data out. I can import it into TransitionManager and create a dependency. So think application runs on device, VM runs on cluster, physical server props up my VMware cluster, right? You can create those relationships that you need based on your migration use case. As I mentioned before, when you're done, typically 3 to 5 data sources that you'll see at the enterprise is you'll have a complete galaxy picture of your IT infrastructure. And again, not just an asset inventory. If we zoom in a little bit here, we're creating relationships as well. what applications are talking to what application is running where and what location. And you really have a launching point where you can start analyzing and planning, and you got there really quickly by aggregating data into TransitionManager. This galaxy picture shot is cool. Most of our customers, it's kind of an aha moment because they haven't seen their environment depicted this way before. But it's not all that useful, right? We have to break this environment down. We have to segment it into workable units so we can migrate it. TransitionManager provides the capability to segment your environment in multiple ways. More often than not, our customers and partners are segmenting by migration method, right? Are they rehosting? Are they rehosting with a certain tool like CloudEndure? Are they reinstalling? Are they tabling it for later for a re-architecture, right? That's a big driver for how the environment is segmented. And the other is workload complexity, right? And what I mean by that is this a production workload? Is it key to my core business? Is it talking to systems that would be difficult to manage if I migrated a workload to the cloud, but I backhauled the connectivity back to my source data center in phases, right? Those are the kind of things that you can break apart and decisions you can make within TransitionManager. And here I'll show you an example of how we can create a rehost segment of AWS candidates, and then we can migrate a selected workload to the cloud using TransitionManager's integration with CloudEndure. Typically in our travels, what we've seen is there's highly mobile workloads that exist at the enterprise. And within TransitionManager, you can identify those up front, start executing on those quickly, while at the same time you may have other work streams going on that you're dealing with the more complicated workloads. Let's say if we're in a data center evacuation use case, no application left behind, eventually you're going to have to deal with the complicated stuff, but why not migrate the rehostable workloads quickly and start moving the needle? These workloads are typically identifiable with data. And in TransitionManager, one way you can create a segment is by using our save view and save filter capability. So I went ahead and I created a filter called highly mobile rehosts, right? These are my candidates that I feel might be great lift and shift candidates to the cloud. And I use simple criteria to start to create my first segment. So I'm filtering, non-production, dev, QA, UAT, staging. I'm looking for a particular virtual machine hypervisor, right? Physical to virtual is not a use case I'm dealing with right now. I'm looking for servers that are already virtualized. And I'm looking for servers that are using a VMware hypervisor, and I'm looking for a hypervisor that's a greater than a specific version. Oftentimes to move something, it has to be in a compatible hypervisor to transform it, to move it to the cloud. Other things that we see is total dependencies. In TransitionManager, you can create derived columns where I can calculate the blast radius for a particular workload. Some of these have less, I'm looking for workloads that have less than 3 interdependencies or less than 3 relationships, with the idea that if the less relationships that it has, the less critical it may be. Other data points that we see that our partners use is total ingress and egress. You might add a column here, and maybe you have a network discovery tool that's doing performance aggregation, and it can tell you how much is ingress and egress from a particular workload. Or you could ingest that data in a TransitionManager, and you can use that in your criteria to create your initial rehost segment. This filter found me about 250 workloads to start, and I went ahead and tagged them with the rehost tag to create my first segment so I can start reaching out to folks and working with teams to figure out, are they accurate and should I move them to the cloud? Let's look at the first workload in our rehost segment, our CentOS Web Test 02. We can drill down in and we can see the detail that we aggregated before with our integration feature, and we can make a quick decision to ensure this is a good candidate to move to the cloud. We can even take it a step further, and we can take a look visually and see the visual blast radius of this system. It looks like there's simply one application running on one server. So this is great. This is a workload that meets the criteria that we set before for rehostable and move to the cloud with CloudEndure. So if we go back, we can go ahead and we can tag this workload again. I'm going to go ahead and tag it with my rehost with CloudEndure tag. Close that out. You'll see it's tagged at the top. And then I'm going to bounce over to our cookbook screen. The cookbook feature, each line in here is what we call a recipe. And each recipe is a templatized workflow of tasks based on use case to perform a migration. It could be T-minus preparation, actual go-live event, or even a combination of both in one event. If we go to this CloudEndure rehost line, you can see when I highlight it at the bottom, it is associated with the rehost CloudEndure tag that I tagged that workload with earlier. So when I generate tasks for the workflow, it's going to recognize the assets that are associated with that tag, and it's going to put it into the workflow. So let's take a look at it and walk through it. This is our task manager view, but to give you a sense of how it's flowing, let's go to our task graph view, which is more like a flow chart. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all the CloudEndure tasks. So all the stuff that's highlighted in red here, this is my automation. So you can see not everything's automated. I have API tasks that are being executed on CloudEndure, but the non-highlighting tasks are manual tasks where a transition manager user gets notified that they're up to do something in the workflow to move this server to the cloud. And we can drill in a little bit here and we can walk through the detail, and then we'll actually move the workload to the cloud with CloudEndure. So we'll start the wave. This is just a manual task of someone kicking the wave off. The application owner is going to log into Transition Manager. They're going to get notified that, hey, you got to go approve this workload so we can move it to the cloud. So you can weave in the approval as well. The arrow points to the successor task. And when the predecessor is done, the successor task will be available to execute. This task is making an API call to a CloudEndure agent to install it on the Linux server, in the server that we tagged earlier. This task, the wait until CloudEndure replication is synced, is simply looking at that replication job in CloudEndure and just ensuring that the replication is in sync and it's ready for a test launch. The next task that we'll execute is another API call, and we're actually going to spin up a test launch in our target AWS cloud via API. Then we're going to have the administrator log into the console in AWS. We're going to have them log into the console in CloudEndure, and we're just going to have them do a tertiary check and just make sure things are going as planned. And then we're going to make an API call to actually initiate the go live in the AWS target, the go live cutover. Wired up to more manual tasks, right? We're going to confirm that everything's looking good in the console. We'll poke the administrator again. And then we're going to notify the application SME, hey, this task is spun up in the cloud, the server, go ahead and test it. And when they log in Transition Manager and sign off, then the wave will be complete. So let's walk through that. And in order to do that, I'm going to introduce you to the Transition Manager desktop application. The Transition Manager desktop application is a companion app for Transition Manager server, right? And the intent is to run this desktop app on the administrator desktop in the customer environment behind the firewall. In most cases, for security reasons, customers aren't going to expose a lot of API endpoints that you'll need to automate end-to-end workloads to the cloud. So if we install a companion app on the administrator desktop, the administrator desktop can fire off those API calls to those endpoints that we don't have access to. And it does it securely, storing credentials. So, we can definitely go through this in more detail in a follow-up demo, but that's the use case. So I'll go ahead and log into this, and so we can walk through the demo. And just forgive me while I have to bounce through some windows. So we'll bounce through the Transition Manager desktop app you see here. We'll also be on Transition Manager, and I'll also be showing you the CloudEndure dashboard as well as my EC2 dashboard in the Amazon console. Okay. So let's take a look at the Task Manager view for our workflow. This is more of a Microsoft project view, as I mentioned before, rather than the flowchart view that we were looking at earlier. And if we remember, the first task here was a manual task, and we were going to begin this migration wave. So I'll mark this as done, and I'll kick this off. The successor task becomes ready. It notifies the application owner, hey, you got to approve that this application is going to the cloud. It's part of the workflow. Nothing else will happen until that person approves. They'll log in Transition Manager. They'll mark it as done. And the next task that becomes available is the task to install the CloudEndure agent on the server that we tagged earlier. And this is an automated API call. So if we bounce over the Transition Manager desktop app and we refresh the task list over here, you'll see that there's a task to invoke to install the CloudEndure agent on our Linux source system. So I'm going to go in over here and I'm going to invoke that call. Again, it's making an API call to the source system and to the CloudEndure console. And eventually what you should see over time is when this is done, the machine will be registered, our test web02, and we can move on with the migration. As you can see here in the CloudEndure dashboard, our server that we tagged in Transition Manager, our CentOS Web Test02, has the agent installed, right? If you recall, we kicked it off from our Transition Manager companion app. It's still running because it still has to, not only does it install the agent, it has to go ahead and sync the data stores between the source and the target EC2. And when that's done, the next task in our workflow will be marked as complete, which is to verify that the source and target VM has been synced. So our replication finished. Our CentOS Web Test02 is synced in the cloud with CloudEndure and our source data center. And if I take a look at Transition Manager, you can see in about 18 minutes, we started the wave. We installed the agent on the CloudEndure server, and we allowed a 10 gigabyte server to sync from our data center to our AWS cloud target. Our next step in our workflow, if you recall, is to initiate a CloudEndure test launch. Again, that's an API integration call. If we go to our flow here, you can see it's highlighted in red, and that's the next task in green that we need to execute. So this is an API call that needs to happen behind the firewall on our Transition Manager desktop companion app. So I'll go ahead and I'll kick that off. And I'll switch over here. You'll see in Transition Manager that should be marked as started because it has started. And you can drill down into the task itself and you can see the status. And it looks like that one is complete. If I go over to my CloudEndure console, and what will happen is a job should kick off here in any moment, which it did at 6:45 p.m. Eastern. The job is started to spin up the test instance, and eventually when that finishes in about 15 minutes or so, we should see a spun up EC2 instance in my EC2 console. And you can see in the EC2 console, our test EC2 instance is starting to get spun up, and that should finish in about 15 minutes or so. And if we're back to our workflow in Transition Manager, we completed the CloudEndure test launch API initiation, and the next task was a manual task for an administrator to go in and make sure that things are launching as they should. We could automate that, but for demonstration purposes, we'll check it manually. And we'll go to our CloudEndure console, and you can see that there's our server and that the target launch has been launched and it's been tested a few seconds ago. And if we go bounce to the EC2 console real quick, you can see I have an instance of the server running, and it's fired up and ready to go. So this was a manual task in our workflow. I'll mark that as done, and the next successor task will become available to execute. This is to an API call, again, that we will initiate from the TransitionManager desktop application to do a production cutover of the EC2, of the CloudEndure replicated EC2 instance. So I'll go back to TransitionManager, and I should see a task now to initiate the cutover, which I do. I'll invoke it. And this should, again, take about 15 minutes for this to complete. So you can see that the TND desktop app kicked off the API call. It reported back to TransitionManager that the API call has started. You can drill down into the task detail, and you can see the audit trail. It was kicked off at 6:50, that it was launched over on the desktop environment. And we'll go ahead and we'll wait about 15 minutes for that to complete, and we'll keep the workflow going. So the next task in our workflow after we made the automated API call to cut the server over was for a human to intervene and confirm that the server was launched in the AWS target cloud. So I can go into my task manager. I can see that these tasks are completed and my task is ready to go. I'll check CloudEndure. You can see that the server has been cut over. So it's running in our target cloud. And if we take a look at the job progress, you can see that the cutover launch was launched at 6:50 p.m. Eastern, and then it went ahead and finished at 6:55. So a 10 gig VM finished in about 5 minutes. And if I jump over to my EC2 console, you'll see now that I have the server up and running live, and it's initializing in production. And CloudEndure also went ahead and cleaned up my test instance that was spun up as part of my test, and any of the replicator targets that it created to replicate the storage. The next part of our workflow, if you recall, there's a human interaction to say, hey, confirm this was launched. So that's a manual task, and we'll mark it done. The next task is we're going to go ping our testers, which is a human's going to get a notification, hey, go test this application on this server in AWS. They'll test it, and then we'll mark this wave complete. And if we go back to our task graph, and we'll see that this server has been migrated from the data center with TransitionManager integration to CloudEndure to our AWS target. So quick summary, we demonstrated within the TransitionManager platform how we can ingest the data from the multiple sources of truth at the enterprise, and we ingest all the right data points from those data sources, right? Data sources are good at certain things. We want to extract out the good things and aggregate them all together. We got to that big map, right, of our environment, that picture that we needed to launch from and start our analysis and planning. And then we went ahead and created our first segment. We were looking for rehostable workloads that are easy to lift and shift to the cloud, so we can start making progress while we have other folks or another work stream working on the more complicated workloads that may require different migration methods and quite a bit more planning to get going. Thanks for your time, and looking forward to speaking further about TransitionManager and our automation at AWS.